Welcome to the lecture on selections from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be talking about the normative ethical theory proposed by Aristotle that deals in virtue and vice. If you've ever heard those terms, virtue and vice, this is the most famous ethical theory that they attach to. Says Aristotle, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. But a certain difference is found among ends. Some are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them. Where there are ends apart from the actions, it is the nature of the products to be better than the activities. Now, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends also are many. The end of medical art is health, that of shipbuilding, a vessel, that of strategy, victory, that of economics, wealth. But where such arts fall under a single capacity, as bridle making and the other arts concerned with the equipment of horses fall under the art of riding, and this and every military action under strategy, in the same way other arts fall under yet others. In all of these, the ends of the master arts are to be preferred to all the subordinate ends, for it is for the sake of the former that the latter are pursued. It makes no difference whether the activities themselves are the ends of the actions or something else apart from the activities, as in the case of the sciences just mentioned. In this very famous quotation, we can see a number of the hallmarks of Aristotle's thought. As Aristotle notes, most of the time when you and I are out there in the world, we're doing things for specific reasons. And the reasons that we're doing things are generally taken to be better than the things that we're doing. Otherwise, we wouldn't do the things that we're doing for those specific reasons. So we try to get to particular goals. And when we look at the goals themselves, when we look at the nature of the goals, we can see that those goals are good insofar as they meet certain criteria, insofar as they're of the best sort that they can possibly be. Similarly, when we look at individual objects out there in the world, including ourselves, those things can be better or worse, good or bad. So, when we're considering how we ought to act, we also need to consider the sorts of beings that we are when we act. This is central to Aristotle's ethical theory. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist who lived from 384 to 322 BCE. Famously, Aristotle was the student of Plato. Plato himself was the student of Socrates. Aristotle was also the tutor of the boy who would go on to become Alexander the Great. Although Plato has the best claim to the title of being the first systematic philosopher, Aristotle took Plato's systematization of philosophy, including the teaching of philosophy, to a whole new level, and Aristotle wrote a number of philosophical treatises, each one devoted to different philosophical topics. So you see that Aristotle has the Poetics, or Aristotle has the metaphysics, or the physics, or books on ethics, or politics. Unlike Plato, who discussed many different things in each one of his dialogues, Aristotle devotes entire works to particular topics. And what we're looking at today is Aristotle's main work in ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. Before we look at Aristotle's particular theory of ethics, though, it'll be helpful to look at the question, what is ethics? Ethics, or morality, I'll use those two terms synonymously here, is the study of the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, the virtuous and the vicious, the fair and the unfair, the just and the unjust, from the perspective of the best overall reasons. Thus, the evidence that's employed by ethicists is reason and argumentation. There's nothing necessarily supernatural or strange or otherworldly about ethics. Take a look at all the best reasons you have for action. When you're evaluating those reasons, you are doing ethics. And when you make a decision based on the best overall reasons, you're making an ethical decision. Nothing spooky or supernatural at all there. Ethics is an investigative discipline that's concerned with what's true in its particular domain, namely ethics. Just as, for example, biologists are concerned with determining what's true about, for example, particular cell functions, ethicists are concerned with determining what's true about the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, the better and the worse, etc. And just as biologists aren't particularly concerned with anyone's mere opinion concerning, for example, cell functions, ethicists are not concerned with anyone's mere opinion concerning what's right and wrong, good and bad, better and worse. Perhaps historians, anthropologists, sociologists are concerned with documenting what people used to believe or believe now in different cultures about what's right and wrong, etc. In the same way as perhaps historians, anthropologists, sociologists are interested in documenting what people believe or believed about particular biological things. But ethics isn't about what people believe, it's about what we have the best overall reason to do concerning our actions, the states of affairs we bring into the world, the sorts of people who we end up being. Aristotle's particular ethical theory is what's known as a theory of normative ethics. Normative ethics is the subdiscipline within philosophical ethics or philosophical morality that studies how particular things get the ethical or moral properties that they have. That is, what grounds ethics? Why is this particular thing right or wrong? Why is that particular person good or bad, virtuous or vicious? These are questions for normative ethics. Normative ethics isn't primarily concerned with which particular people or states of affairs or actions have which particular ethical properties, but instead with an overall explanation of ethics. There is a philosophical subdiscipline that investigates individual actions such as affirmative action or abortion or the death penalty to see whether those actions are good or bad, right or wrong. That's applied ethics. This is normative ethics that tries to figure out what grounds those particular actions having the properties that they do. The goal of normative ethics is to provide a coherent theory of all and only the basic ethically relevant facts, the necessary and sufficient conditions for something's having an ethical property. So just as, for example, a biologist might give a theory of what it takes for something to be alive, such that all and only the things that fall under that theory are the living things, a normative ethicist will give a theory of, for example, what makes people good or bad, what makes actions right or wrong. And now let's look very briefly at three approaches to normative ethics. Within the normative ethical tradition, there have been three main ways of addressing normative ethical questions. Questions about what makes things right or wrong, good or bad, virtuous or vicious. Each of these directions takes a different thing, a different object or property, to be the main unit of moral evaluation. One of these units that's taken to be the main unit of moral evaluation, and one of the three approaches to normative ethics, is to take the person as central. This approach asks which sorts of people or character traits are better ones and which ones are worse ones. If you've ever talked about a person as a good person or a bad person, or used more colorful language maybe, you're taking this particular approach to normative ethics. Second, states of affairs, the way the world is. An approach to normative ethics that takes states of affairs or particular states in the world to be the main unit of moral evaluation asks questions like, which sorts of states of the world are the better ones and which are the worse ones? And finally, an approach to normative ethics that takes actions as primary, as the main unit of moral evaluation, asks questions such as which sorts of actions are the better ones and which are the worse ones. Now, notice that these three all sound very similar, but what they take to be central is different, and so the theories that arise from them are different. The first one, that takes persons as the main unit of moral evaluation, is tied closely with Aristotle's moral theory, which we'll look at today. The second one, which takes states of affairs, ways the world can be, as central or primary, that's mainly tied with John Stuart Mill. And the final one, that takes actions as the main unit of moral evaluation, that is most closely tied with Immanuel Kant. Let's turn now to Aristotle. As we've just noted, Aristotle's normative moral theory, a theory that tells us what makes things good or bad, better or worse, virtuous, vicious, etc., says that the primary unit of moral evaluation is the person. According to Aristotle, ethics should primarily be concerned with the sorts of people that we are, and only secondarily concerned, if at all, with the sorts of actions we should perform or the sorts of states of affairs that we should bring about. Now, presumably, Aristotle could say that since a virtuous person is such and such, has particular properties, then, for example, right actions are the ones performed by virtuous people in support of and pursuit of their virtue, and good states of affairs are the ones brought about by virtuous people in support of and in pursuit of their virtue. But notice that for Aristotle, it really is all about people. It's not the case that good actions make good people. It's that good people make good actions. It's not the case that people who make the world better are good people. It's that the world is made better because of the goodness of people. Morality bottoms out in the particular character traits of people, the types of people that are out there. So since we notice that Aristotle says begin with people, it's really all about people, we might ask, well, Aristotle, what sorts of people should we be? What's your theory? This question can be posed in a bunch of different ways. What sorts of people should we be? What sorts of lives should we lead? What sorts of character traits should we have? According to Aristotle, we should be the sorts of people, lead the sorts of lives, have the sorts of character traits that promote the supreme good for things like us. That sounds lofty and interesting, but it doesn't tell us all that much. So what is it that's supposed to be the supreme good for things like us? Well, happiness, of course. But again, that doesn't tell us very much. There's nobody out there who says that we shouldn't be happy, that happiness in itself is a bad thing. And even people who claim that happiness is not the supreme good seem merely to be claiming that some particular definition of happiness, like hedonistic pleasure or something like that, is incorrect, and these people are offering their own definition of pleasure. So far, all Aristotle has told us by saying that we should be the sorts of people who promote the supreme good for ourselves, and that supreme good is happiness. All that's being told here is that we should be excellent. Well, of course we should be excellent. Nobody would say otherwise. But what does that mean? Well, first, we should dispense with three failed accounts of what the highest good is for things like this, what happiness is for humans like us. These are wealth and honor and pleasure, and Aristotle gets rid of them very quickly. There are a number of people out there who confuse the supreme good for things like us, people like us, with wealth or honor or pleasure. But the problem is, says Aristotle, that either an account of morality that places the supreme good in terms of wealth or honor or pleasure just misunderstands the notion of what goodness is to begin with, or it locates the supreme good outside of us. And this can't possibly be a theory of the sorts of people we should be, says Aristotle, if it locates what's good for us outside of us. So briefly, here's what Aristotle says about each of wealth, honor, and pleasure, and why they can't possibly be the correct interpretation of happiness or the supreme or highest good for things like us. Wealth, says Aristotle, isn't even good. It's not good in itself. It's good because of what it can get. Philosophers call this instrumental goodness. A dollar bill on its own isn't a good thing. A dollar bill is good because of what it can get you. So an account of the supreme or highest good for things like us in terms of wealth is saying that something that isn't actually even good in itself is good. So this misunderstands even the notion of goodness. Honor? This can't be the correct interpretation of the supreme or highest good for things like us, says Aristotle, because honor isn't dependent on the particular person who receives the honor. Honor is dependent on the opinions of other people. But if morality, ethics, is supposed to be all about the sorts of people we should be, I can't make myself the sort of person who receives honor. It's up to other people whether I get honor. Sure, I might become a lickspittle and I might follow people around and give them what they want so that they honor me, but still, since it's not up to me whether I get honor, honor can't possibly be what's ultimately good for me. Finally, pleasure. Pleasure might be one of the things that a number of people say we should get in our lives, and Aristotle's not saying that there's anything wrong with pleasure. What he's saying is that pleasure is not the greatest, highest, most supreme good for things like you and me, and the reason for this is that pleasure isn't unique to persons. Other things other than persons can achieve pleasure. Dogs and cats can achieve pleasure, for example. Also, this account of pleasure as the highest good would misunderstand the notion of the highest good because it doesn't take into account the unique properties of persons. Yes, dogs and cats can get pleasure, but there are a lot of things that humans can do that dogs and cats can't do. So if pleasure is supposed to be the greatest, highest, most supreme good for things like you and me, it reduces us to mere dogs and cats. But that's just false of us. We're different from mere dogs and cats. So the highest good, says Aristotle, must be something that's valuable in itself and not valuable for the sake of something else. This is what wealth, honor, and pleasure all get wrong. Aristotle's account of the supreme highest good for things like you and me, his account of what happiness is supposed to be, comes to us in terms of the Greek term eudaimonia. For Aristotle, happiness, the supreme good for things like you and me, is the same as eudaimonia, is the same as flourishing, is the same as well-being. Well, what are any of these? Consider our lives in analogy to the life of, for example, a flower. For a flower to flourish is for it to be nourished, for it to grow, for it to have sunlight and soil and water, for it to strain towards the sun, for it to get high, and for its petals to stretch out far. There's something about the nature of a flower that determines what it would be for a flower to flourish. This flourishing consists in the flower being able to fully express its nature. So when you think of us participating in happiness, eudaimonia, of us flourishing, of us having lives full of well-being, think about us in analogy to a flower. But, of course, you and I aren't flowers, so what's good for me, what's good for you, is not exactly the same, although it's analogous to what's good for a flower. If what determines what's good for a flower is its nature, then we'll need to figure out what our nature is. What is it to be one of us? In order to figure this out, Aristotle employs a famous argument that's come to be known as the function argument. The function argument looks like this. What you and I are good for, that is, our function, is what is good for us. That is, what the best sort of life is for us. So in order to figure out what we are good for, what our function is, what our nature is, we have to ask, what's our proper function? That is, what is it that we do that nothing else does? This argument is deceptively simple. In order to figure out the sorts of things we ought to be, we need to figure out the sorts of things that we are deep down at our core, at our essence. In order to figure out what we're good for, we need to figure out what is good for us. So what is it that we do that other things don't do? What's so, not special, but unique about you and me? Well, says Aristotle, it can't be that we're alive, because lots of other things are alive. Grass is alive. Trees are alive. Slugs are alive. And it can't be sentience, the ability to feel things, to experience things, because other things are sentient. Cats and dogs and horses, they're all sentient, but it seems like you and I do things that are different from or over and above sentience. What it is that we're good for, says Aristotle, is rationality. And thus, what's good for us, according to the function argument, is rationality. Or, more accurately, what's good for us is to use our rationality properly. Now, there are many different theories in the philosophical literature that span 3,000 years or so about what rationality is. But think of rationality in terms of considering your options and making choices based on evidence. Thus, for Aristotle, eudaimonia is rational human flourishing, and it's the highest good for things like us. Notice how far we've come. We started out with that what you and I ought to be doing is making ourselves the sort of things that pursue the highest or most supreme good for things like us. The highest or most supreme good for things like us was identified with happiness. Happiness is not wealth, it's not honor, it's not pleasure, either because those things misunderstand the nature of goodness, or because they aren't actually up to us and therefore they can't be about our moral lives. The function argument says that whatever it is that we ought to get ourselves up to in our lives is what it is that makes us unique, makes us the rational human creatures that we are, and that's rationality. And so, in order to be good ones of us, we need to use our rationality properly. This is where we get to the heart of Aristotle's theory. Aristotle's theory employs the term virtue and says that in order to be a good one of us, we need to be virtuous. This term has religious overtones, but we don't need to think about virtue in religious terms. Virtue is just to be a good, rational human creature. But what exactly is virtue? Let's break this down. According to Aristotle, the proper use of our rationality just is virtue. Thus, being virtuous is simply flourishing in our rational human sense. We might say that by analogy, when a flower flourishes, it's being virtuous in its own flowerly sense. When a cat is doing whatever it is that makes a cat flourish, the cat is being virtuous. When you and I are doing the particular things that make us us, namely, pursuing rationality, we are flourishing and therefore are being virtuous. A virtue, and here's a definition, is a trait of character manifested in action that lies in the mean between the extremes of excess and efficiency that is good for anyone to have. There are 4 components of that definition that are important to understand, so let's break them down one at a time. 1. A trait of character. This is something relatively stable about you across time that helps determine the way that you'll analyze evidence, make choices, and act. People's character traits help determine what we might nowadays call their personality. So if you get angry once sort of accidentally, anger isn't one of your character traits. But if you're a generally angry, short-tempered person, that might be one of your character traits. Second, virtues are manifested in action. It's not enough to have something underground in your brain that might cause you to act certain ways but never actually does. According to Aristotle, what's important about a virtue is that it's expressed via your actions. It shows up via your actions. It's not enough to say, I'm a nice person if you never actually perform acts of kindness. It's not enough to say, I am a humorous person if you never end up actually making anybody laugh. To be kind, to be humorous, is to not only have particular mental states, according to Aristotle, but also to manifest those states in action. Third, a virtue lies in the mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. So take any particular character trait. If you have too little of it, that's no good. If you have too much of it, that's also no good. It needs to lie in the mean between the extremes of excess, too much, and deficiency, too little. And we'll look momentarily at a whole bunch of examples that Aristotle gives us of a trait of character lying in the mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. And a virtue is the sort of thing that needs to be good for anyone to have. It can't just be the sort of thing that accidentally benefits 1 or 2 people now and then. It needs to be the sort of thing that's good for anyone, and remember why this is. To be virtuous is to be using your rationality properly. Now, we're not all rational to the same degree, but the sort of thing that makes me rational is the same as the sort of thing that makes you rational. Rationality is the same, at least sort of property or ability across all rational creatures. And so, if a virtue is good for me, it has to be good for you as well. Really, the most important thing to remember of all 4 of these is the third, that a virtue lies in the mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. And so you really can think of Aristotle as providing the Goldilocks theory of ethics. The porridge shouldn't be too hot, it shouldn't be too cold, it needs to be just right. The bed can't be too hard or too soft, it needs to be just right. The trait of character can't be excessive, can't be deficient, it needs to be just right or lie in the mean between those two extremes. In order to understand virtue, it helps to contrast it with things that are non-virtuous. Aristotle talks about 4 different ways that we can be with respect to our own rationality. We can be virtuous, we can be continent, we can be incontinent, or we can be vicious. Now, since virtue is not just what we do, but instead, remember, who we are, we need to look at more than just actions in determining whether some person is virtuous or not. We need to look at 3 things: a person's desire, a person's choices, and a person's actions. Recall that Aristotle says it's all about people. It's not just about what people end up doing. It's not just about how people end up changing the world for the better or the worse. It's about the sorts of people that people are. When we consider a person's desires, their choices, and their actions, we can see how good a person actually is. The best sort of person, a virtuous person, is a person who desires the good, chooses the good, and acts on the good. This is a person who wants to do the right thing for the right reasons and ends up succeeding in doing it. It feels good for the virtuous person to do the right thing. The continent person, and this is most of us most of the time, desires the bad, chooses the good, and acts on the good. The continent person is a person who recognizes that it might be pleasurable or fun to do the wrong thing, but ends up recognizing that it is in fact the wrong thing, and because they recognize that it's the wrong thing, they make the correct decision and they act to do the right thing. So, you might want to, for example, engage in gossip, but you recognize that you shouldn't and therefore you don't. Or you might want to skip going to the gym, but you recognize that you really should go, and so you do. The continent person, notice, is a person who has the desire to do bad, but can hold it in. Contrast this with the incontinent person. This is a person who desires the bad, chooses the good, but ends up still acting on the bad. This is a person who, just like the continent person, wants to do the wrong thing and also recognizes that the wrong thing is the wrong thing. The continent person has a strong will and is able to overcome her desires, while the incontinent person has a weak will. And even though she recognizes that the thing she desires is the wrong thing, she succumbs, and she ends up doing the wrong thing. If you've ever said to yourself, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to anyway, that's an example of incontinence. This is a person who feels that they want to do the wrong thing and can't hold it in. They're incontinent. The vicious person, this is the worst sort. The vicious person desires the bad. So just like the continent and the incontinent person, the vicious person wants to do the wrong thing. However, what separates the vicious person from the continent and the incontinent person is that the vicious person chooses to do the wrong thing. It's not mere weakness of will that makes the vicious person do the wrong thing. They not only want to do it, they choose to do it. They say, this is what I'm about. I want to do this thing. In a sense, they don't even recognize that it's the wrong thing to do. They just do what they want to. They don't recognize that it's bad. And then they succeed in doing the wrong thing. Vicious people are very rare. Most of us recognize why we should be doing what we should be doing, even if we have a weak will and end up doing the wrong thing. The vicious person is the person who just doesn't get why they should do the thing that they should be doing. They think they should be doing the thing that they actually shouldn't be doing, and then they succeed in doing the wrong thing. Now, when we look at this notion of what virtue is compared to continence, incontinence, and viciousness, and we remember that virtue is a trait of character that's good for anyone to have, that's manifested in action and lies in the mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency, we can start generating a list of the virtues, a list of the good traits of character that anyone should have. Now, Aristotle comes up with his own long, complicated list, and we'll look at that momentarily. When we look at Aristotle's list, though, remember that this is Aristotle working out his own theory and trying to figure out specifically which traits you should have and which ones you shouldn't. If you disagree with Aristotle's particular list, but you like his overall theory, you might say, well, he's just gotten it wrong in this case, but the theory is still sound. So I'm just going to reject this and come up with a new virtue here. Here's Aristotle's table. As you notice, it's long and complicated. I've bolded the mean between the extremes of deficiency and excess. This mean is the list of traits of character that the virtuous person ought to have. So let's just look at a couple of these. The first one, in terms of the character trait of fear and confidence, if you have too little confidence, you're a coward. If you have too much confidence, you are rash or foolhardy. If you have just enough confidence and just enough fear, remember the Goldilocks theory, then you're a courageous person, but you don't do stupid things. Or let's look at pleasure and pain. If you have too little, you aren't sensitive enough. You're insensible. If you have too much, you overindulge. You self-indulge. If you have just enough, you're temperate. Doesn't mean you don't indulge a little bit. Doesn't mean you don't have anything at all. Doesn't mean you overindulge. Means you have some. Now, for any particular trait that you can come up with, there's going to be too little or too much that you could possibly have. Aristotle says, find that mean between the extremes. Now, recall why you should find that mean. That's just you using your rational human capabilities properly. Think about using some tool, scissors. If you use the scissors to cut, for example, paper that's of the thickness that the scissors can cut, you've done the right thing with the scissors. But if you take the scissors to a piece of metal and you break the scissors, you've done something wrong. If you just take the scissors and you start clipping them in the air and you don't cut anything, you've also done something wrong. Wrong with respect to what? Wrong with respect to the sorts of things that the scissors are. The nature of the scissors tells you how to use them. Similarly, says Aristotle, our own human natures tell us how to use ourselves. So you might be saying, virtue says who? Why should I be virtuous? This really sounds like a command that Aristotle is giving us. Get out there, be virtuous, I'm Aristotle. Do this. But recall the project of normative ethics. The project is to provide a theory of the grounding of ethical properties. So what Aristotle is doing isn't commanding anything to you. He's telling you what it is that he thinks makes certain people better people or worse people. And according to him, what it is that the better people end up using their own natural capabilities rationally. They use them to the amount that they should. Worse people end up not using their capabilities or overusing their capabilities and burning out. Ethics is not about commands. Commands and ethics are two separate things. Instead, ethics is about what's actually right or wrong, good or bad, better or worse. It's about what we actually ought to be as people, what we actually ought to do. So why think that Aristotle is right? He claims that we ought to be the sorts of people that are properly rational components support. We need to use all of our parts properly. Now, if you disagree, what is it that makes you disagree here? Do you think that maybe we shouldn't use our rational components well? Do you think that rationality is perhaps irrelevant to the sorts of things that we should be? Maybe do you think that we shouldn't focus on individuals? Is it about something else? If you disagree with Aristotle, though, you should have some good reason for disagreeing with him, and you don't have to have a fully fleshed out theory, but you should at least have some alternate theory in the offing that we might be able to expand upon. Now, Aristotle is only one of the many famous ethicists. Two other famous ethicists, Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill, focus on different aspects of the normative ethical project. But Aristotle's ethical theory has captured people's rational minds for over 2,000 years. It seems that what Aristotle is doing is giving us an owner's manual for the sorts of things that we already are. In this lecture, we've taken a look at Aristotle's normative theory as it was proposed in his Nicomachean ethics. Normative ethics is the project of saying what grounds ethics or morality, what makes certain things right or wrong, good or bad, certain people better or worse. Recall that morality is not commands, it's not punishment, it's not opinion, it's what actually is right or wrong. And Aristotle is giving us a theory about this. And the theory comes in terms of the sorts of things that we are essentially. Aristotle thinks that's rational things, and to be good ones of us, we need to use that rationality properly. Thank you.